What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the 6th episode of Season 4. Today, we are breaking down different NFL prospects that have massive fantasy potential. And for a show like this, I had to bring on a man that is on the Mount Rushmore of Dynasty fantasy football analysts. He is known as one of the most accurate people on the planet when it comes to rookies. And he is always bringing hard-hitting Twitter threads almost every single week, and is another person probably on that list of the most underfollowed people on all of fantasy Twitter. He is now the lead dynasty analyst at 33rd Team with over 11,000 followers. He is Ian Miller. Welcome to the show for the first time.
Yeah, it's about time. Thank you very much for having me on. We've had lots of conversations about rookies and everything in between, so it's great to finally talk about them.
Exactly. And now we are only a couple weeks away from the NFL draft. There's going to be a lot of players. They're going to land in a lot of spots. Then we'll have even more to break down. So I'm excited for that. But now it's time to talk about a few prospects today. So we're going to do some quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, talk about some guys that are the major names, like your Bijan Robinsons, your Anthony Richardsons, people like that. But we're also going to give you some questions on some guys that maybe people don't really know much about, and some guys that have some really big fantasy potential that might be getting, overlooked a little bit. So let's start at the very top, when it comes to our dynasty drafts. And the first player that I think everybody wants to hear about is none other than Bijan Robinson himself. Universally right now, the 1.01 of fantasy drafts right now without a super big quarterback and super flex leagues. Is the hype real on Bijan Robinson? Like, what do you think his ceiling is for his rookie year?
Yeah, I mean, the hype is real. He can be literally the best running back that we've seen. He's up there with the greatest prospects of running backs to come out in recent memory, like including Saquon Barkley. Although I think part of the thing with Saquon was maybe back when he got drafted, the NFL hadn't adapted so much to hating running backs as they do now. So that's why you see Saquon going number 2. I think if we go back to that year, there's a possibility that a prospect like Bijan goes number 2. But there's so much in the Bijan profile that just leads you to success, even starting off with like pretty simple things like being successful in college, like running backs to produce with a profile like his. So elite plus running backs to have multiple 23 plus point per game seasons before turning even 21, which is what he will be when he goes into the NFL draft. Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Breece Hall, LaShawn McCoy, Ezekiel Elliott, Ray Rice, and Todd Gurley. And that'll add Bijan. And the thing is, when we talk it, like 23 plus points per game in college fantasy football isn't like some crazy amount. Like people produce crazy amounts in college, which would surprise you for those that don't play like college fantasy. Like we have quarterbacks, not to get off track here, but elite plus quarterbacks. I haven't had one that's elite to score less than 40 points in a to never have 40 points. So college fantasy, they score a lot, but Bijan Robinson scoring that much puts him in a pretty high bucket. And then when you just want to narrow it down and keep going to buckets, you can find him in just generational prospect territory. Like when we talk about running back prospects that have multiple 50% plus rushing yard shares and 10% plus receiving yard shares before turning 21. So getting a little more technical, the only other first round running backs would be Christian McCaffrey and Saquon. So when you think of generational running backs, you're kind of talking about Bijan, Saquon, and Christian McCaffrey. Like those are the guys that keep showing up.
Yeah, on top of that, I mean, Derek Brown, Fantasy Pros the other day did a thread about some of these like elite plus running backs. I mean, these are all guys that have, top 10 fantasy finishes at some point in their career. And then in addition to that list, there was Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker. And among those 14 players that were all like the elite of the elite, Bijan in college is first in yards after contact, first in PFF elusiveness rating. He actually has the single best elusiveness rating in PFF history. And among all these elite running backs that were pretty good pass catchers, I mean, he was 7th in yards per route run. I mean, like you go on and on and on and find all these different buckets. Every single one, Bijan is among the elite of the elite. I think wherever he lands, no matter what team it is, I think he is going to find his way into a top 15, if not a top 10 finish for sure, if not higher. And if he ends up in somewhere like the Chargers, the Chiefs, or somewhere crazy like that, the potential is unlimited. But on the wide receiver position, there's one guy for me that has that insane potential more than anyone, and it's Jackson Smith and Jigba. I mean, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson were his teammates in their final year in college with him, and he outproduced both of them. And before they were drafted, because a lot of people have been saying that they're hyping him up just to bump up his draft stock, but before they got drafted, both of those guys said that he is the best of all three of them, even though those guys are two top 10 wide receivers in Dynasty right now. Do you think that they're just blowing smoke, or do you think that there's a real chance that Jackson Smith and Jigba is that guy and could be a generational type wide receiver prospect?
I think there's a little bit of both. So that's why I like that question.
Okay.
Is I think he's really good. And I also think that, they're blowing a little bit of smoke to help him out, if that makes sense. Like, I think if you were to ask Garrett Wilson individually, who's better, you or him, and he's being 100% honest, he's going to tell you himself, obviously. And that makes sense for someone who had such a great rookie season, borderline historic. But when we're talking about Jackson Smith and Jigba, he did outproduce those guys when he was there as a 19-year-old. He went off that year with guys like Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, and that's not to mention guys like Marvin Harrison and Mika Buka behind him, and a few other names. But we're kind of in the season, like, especially now where you start getting these quotes, like I know the Brian Hartline quote where Marvin Harrison's the best wide receiver he's ever coached at Ohio State, and then Jackson Smith and Jigba. Like, yes, I think there's some truth to it. Well, also I think he's going to tell you the guys that haven't been drafted yet are probably up there. Although it did kind of get me that he didn't say Buka anywhere on his list and kind of threw Terry in there, but that's neither here or there. But we're in that prospect season where, we've had A.J. Brown say that Elijah Moore is the best wide receiver he's ever played with. Like, you get these quotes that'll kind of hype guys up, but at the same time, Jackson Smith and Jigba has a profile that backs that up, if that makes sense, to where it is believable. So, like, because we only really have that full season to go off of for Jackson Smith and Jigba, and he put up a 90-plus PFF grade that season, which isn't something that Olave or Garrett Wilson did. And the only 19-year-olds that have ever done that is just Ja'Marr Chase. So when you talk about Jackson Smith and Jigba, you do find them in kind of ridiculous buckets in the same thing. Like when we talk about Power 5 wide receivers to put up a 3+ yards per team pass attempt and 20+ points per game at that same age, it's again Ja'Marr Chase, Dez Bryant, Michael Crabtree. Like, I think no matter where you look, Jackson Smith and Jigba projects to be someone who has quite a high ceiling despite all the slot percentage that everyone wants to talk about. But the thing is, if you earn targets at a high rate, even though it may not be as maximizing to be in the slot versus at the Y, like when we're talking about where's the most maximization to have a high target rate, obviously on the outside will give you a little bit higher ceiling. But that doesn't mean, like, we're in an era where if you earn a lot of targets, you're fine. Like, look at Cooper Kupp, like what he did in the slot. Like, there is an absolute path to do it. And someone who has been as good as Jackson Smith and Jigba is someone we can obviously project to have that high ceiling. Like, maybe there's a little bit of smoke based on what receivers and his coaches are saying just to bump that draft stock a little bit. But, I mean, especially if he does go, whereas I think his expected draft positions like within the top 15 right now. And that should also just take things away from what you feel about slot percentage, especially in the NFL now. Like,
yep.
Justin Jefferson's not coming out was his slot percentage, and he fell to 22, if that's what you want to say. And the NFL might just be adapting to really good receivers or really good. So,
yeah, I think the biggest things to note with JSN is just that, like, I mean, of all college wide receivers over the last 2 years, only Chris Olave beat man coverage at a higher rate. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the Jackson Smith and Jigba ranks the 97th percentile in beating press coverage. But if I want the people to take away one thing from JSN for this entire podcast, it's that there have been 2 college wide receivers ever at age 19 or younger to put up a 90+ PFF grade, and that is him and Ja'Marr Chase. That is all you should need to know. Let's move on to the next big player in this class, the running back position. Kind of going back there is Jahmyr Gibbs. I know people have been saying it different ways. I'm not sure how the correct way is, but he right now is the consensus running back 2 in this class. And do you think that this is a lack of just a really great class of running backs, or do you think that Jahmyr Gibbs actually has that big potential? Because I've seen people saying that he's the second coming of DeAndre Swift in a good way, where he could be this, generational type pass catching running back. Then I've also heard the other part where people are saying, okay, this guy can catch a lot of passes, but he's just going to be a third down back. He can't run the ball, through the tackles. So like, what do you think the real truth is with Gibbs? Like, is he the real deal and this is a weak running back class, or do you think that he's someone that has a lot of fantasy potential as early as his rookie year?
Yeah, I like the question because there's a lot of different answers that come from it. And I'll first start off by saying Jahmyr Gibbs is someone who has a very unique profile. What I mean by that is, his knock is that he's not going to be someone who's known to carry a high volume of rushing attempts. And the thing is, we don't necessarily need that. I think one of my favorite stats when talking about Gibbs and the knock on that is the top two running backs last season was Austin Eckler and Christian McCaffrey, both of whom didn't carry like Josh Jacobs level carry percentages, but what they did in the passing game clearly elevates your floor as well as your ceiling, as we just saw. So, and the other thing is Christian McCaffrey also weighed in at the combine at 202 pounds. So we're not talking like he's not Christian McCaffrey, don't get me wrong, but he clearly has the potential, especially if the NFL likes him. I think that's the other thing is if you're like, okay, well, he doesn't have the rushing chops. Well, that doesn't take as much off of your ceiling or your floor as a fantasy player or producer as much as receiving production does, if that makes sense. So when we talk about Jahmyr Gibbs, if the NFL likes him enough to have him in the second round, then he's absolutely going to have the possibility to kind of break fantasy football in the way that he catches passes. So just like touch on how good Jahmyr Gibbs is, what he did at such an early age as a receiver is pretty much unheard of. So like when we talk about similar like profiles, so in this one, I'm not going to talk about Ty Montgomery, who's, yes, he's listed as a running back, but he's a wide receiver in college. So you kind of get some of those guys that throw it off a little bit when you talk about high receiving shares. But if we just talk about elite plus running back prospects with the highest freshman receiving yard market share, Chris Johnson has the highest at 10%. Christian McCaffrey's second highest at 9.1%. You know what Jahmyr Gibbs did when he was 18? 21.7%. He doubled the next highest elite plus running back. So this is someone who absolutely is a fantastic receiving back. And if the NFL likes him enough to take him in the second round, which is a premium investment, especially at the running back position, then that's going to have quite a high opportunity to be showed display. Like he's going to have the opportunity to show off how good he is in the receiving game. Like
what's the one team you think that takes Gibbs to the next level?
I mean, shoot, you're going to want a team that has high passing ability or high passing production, efficiency, and attempts. So like a team like the Chargers, especially if Austin Eckler really is gone, which I don't think he will be, but a team like the Chargers, a team like the Bengals, like a team that is going to throw the ball a lot, only benefits someone like Jahmyr Gibbs, who, especially when you get in 2-minute situations where those receiving chubs basically multiply how many fantasy points you're going to get on a drive. That is something that we would love to see. A team like that rather than, a team like the Ravens, which I don't think that's too much of a possibility. Just using an example here of like really low volume passing teams like the Bears, that would kind of stink for a Jahmyr Gibbs profile. Like, I think when you talk about prospects and we talk about situation, you should always take a good prospect, but there's obviously some situations that elevate ceilings. Like a Jahmyr Gibbs that lands in Cincinnati absolutely has a much higher ceiling right off the bat than if he lands in like Chicago, for example. Not that I think he will, but yeah, I mean, the other thing that I do push back on is I think because I see a lot of tweets like Jahmyr Gibbs would be the RB1 in any other class, but I think you kind of, with that one, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is really good. But then I think you don't realize how good we've had some running backs that come out. Like just looking in recent years, we're going Bijan now. It was Breece Hall the year before. Before that, you're looking at like Jonathan Taylor. Like missed a year there. We had Travis Etienne. And then you go Jonathan Taylor and you keep going back to Saquon Barkley. And then you get Christian McCaffrey. Like there's been really, really good RB1s in classes. So I think saying Jahmyr Gibbs would be the RB1 in any other class is a little crazy. But that being said, he's someone who absolutely projects, especially in today's game. Like we just saw Austin Eckler, he's like never had a 50% carry percentage. And I saw one stat, like an Austin Eckler stat, he's never had a 20 plus rushing attempt game. Like that's just not in the profile. And the same should be said for Jahmyr Gibbs. And yeah.
I love that. And what about someone like Anthony Richardson? I mean, like we've seen there's been comparisons to Cam Newton, Lamar Jackson, because of his rushing ability. I mean, he's probably outside of Lamar Jackson, I think that he's like arguably the most electric running quarterback that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. We've also seen the fact that he is as bad of a passer as probably anybody that we've seen over the last few years as well. So again, just like with Jahmyr Gibbs and the upside versus like what could actually happen, like what do you think Anthony Richardson's ceiling is, and what do you think it's more likely that he ends up finishing, seeing that we get the Cam Newton comparisons, like consensus QB1 versus the Malik Willis, like is going to fall to the third round, and how much do you think draft capital is going to come into that in terms of like what we should be expecting for him versus where an NFL team actually takes him?
Yeah, so he's clearly somewhere in between a Cam Newton and Malik Willis, and I think you'd favor more the Cam Newton side because everything that we've seen so far is that Anthony Richardson is going to get that high draft capital. Grinding the Mocks, who does a really good job at projecting future draft capital by compiling mocks and getting data out of it, they have his current expected draft position at 4.8. So when you have someone who's going to, like in his loan eligible season at Florida, he had a 27% plus rushing yard market share. And when you combine that with premium draft capital, he's going to score fantasy points. Like in terms of fantasy football, we don't really need the passing production right away. And the biggest example of this is Justin Fields. Like the last 2 years, Justin Fields has, no matter how you chop it up, stats wise, has been one of the worst passing quarterbacks in the NFL. But because of his Konami status, he literally finished as quarterback 5 last year because of what he does on the ground. So because of that, if a team invests high premium draft capital in someone that has that ability and that level of floor, well, then just let the passing play out. Because no matter what, going into year 2, whether he's good or bad as a passer, that value isn't going to tank because of it. Like we said, Justin Fields was a terrible passer after year 1. His ADP rose. Even Trevor Lawrence wasn't very good as a passer his rookie year. His ADP rose. So it's the fact that you combine athleticism, Konami rushing, and the fact that he's likely to get taken early in the draft. And just to throw this bucket out there, if we combine those 3 things, so the Konami rushing type, clearly very athletic with a 9+ relative athletic score, and he's declaring early. So we expect high draft capital. The only 3 other quarterbacks that have done that since 2006, Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, Justin Fields. So you're finding yourself, again, good buckets.
I love that. That is a huge thing to put in. That is a crazy group to be in, and hopefully he gets drafted because I know the draft capital thing is everything, and obviously that no matter what we have in dynasty, like the NFL, where the NFL ends up taking these players is probably the most critical piece of it. But if he gets drafted top 5, top 10, I think the wheels are up for him. I think the other thing that I also wanted to mention that I think gets a little bit overlooked is when you look at someone like Anthony Richardson, like he is 2 or 3 years younger than some other quarterbacks in this class, like Will Levis. So he doesn't need to come out and start the first year at 21 years old. Like he has a little bit of time to develop, where other quarterbacks like Hendon Cooker or Stetson Bennett are 25 years old and have had a lot more time to develop. But again, someone like that has a lot of potential, and I'm excited to see how that plays out. In terms of dynasty specifically, is there any other quarterback real quick that you think has a lot of fantasy potential that's getting a little bit overlooked? Or do you think that it's just going to be draft capital is everything? Whoever gets drafted in the first 2 rounds are the only quarterbacks that are likely to produce in dynasty?
Yeah, I'm on that train that I'm not sure that there's really an underrated quarterback from
Okay.
low in draft capital. It kind of ends up being just, maybe they'll have a Desmond Ridder situation. Maybe they'll have a Malik Willis. Like they're just not good prospects. And when it comes to quarterbacks, I really only want to invest in good prospects. So if we're talking about the most undervalued, I would say if Anthony Richardson's ADP ends up behind Stroud and Young, he instantly, because of the other 2, becomes the most undervalued quarterback in this class. Clearly the highest ceiling and honestly the highest floor too. Because as good as Young and Stroud are as prospects, projecting passing to the next level is not even close to the same realm or correlation as projecting rushing volume to the next level. Because like when we talk about, let's say whoever doesn't go 1, whether that's Young or Stroud, then you're kind of talking about like buckets that include like Tua as good as he is, Herbert as good as he is, but then there's downside risks, like Sam Darnold as one. I don't think Josh Rosen's a good example, but passing is hard to project to the next level. And so I think if Anthony Richardson's ADP ends up at like 104 behind Stratton Young, he instantly becomes the most undervalued quarterback in the class.
Like that. That is, oh, I like that. I didn't realize how much that things like, I know that draft capital plays a part, but I didn't realize the fact that from an NFL perspective, that if Anthony Richardson does go at number 4 overall, that could make him the most underrated quarterback in this class. Where if he goes, late first round, second round, or somewhere even beyond that, if he falls somewhere to where Malik Willis did, that actually can tank his like what his real time value should be in dynasty drafts. That's really, really interesting. But what about the same question with running backs? Is there any running back that you think has a lot of potential, or even someone that has more potential in fantasy versus in real life?
Yeah, I think what we've gotten in terms of running backs for this draft class has been a little bit underwhelming, at least when we're looking at like projected draft capital versus what we expected the 2023 running back class to be moving forward. Because we clearly have the big names in Bijan and Gibbs. And then after that, the only one that you like feel comfortable getting pretty close to second round draft capital would have to be Zach Charbonnet. And obviously he doesn't have the most perfect profile, but wherever he lines up will obviously help his value, or however you want to say it. But I will say, if we want to talk about undervalued, I'd have to say Devin Achane. I think people are getting caught up on kind of his lower lack of size, but he did 2 things that we like to see. He's athletic, and most importantly, he produced at Texas A&M. I mean, when we talk about Isaiah Spiller, who at an early point last year, he appeared to be a really good prospect, and given draft capital, I agreed with that. And this is someone that Devin Achane already beat out in Isaiah Spiller. So Devin Achane also, the other thing is he was really good rusher, and he carried a high percentage of carries for Texas A&M. So I will say this, and it's one of my favorite pieces of information, comes from a running back guru and David Wilsey. He says it's not always about the size when you look at things, because being a running back is taking multiple car collisions every weekend and recovering from it. So if in college we have a running back who has a high carry percentage, he's proven that he is able to withstand these car accidents that he gets every weekend. And despite Achane's size, he had a pretty high carry percentage in college. So I think he's not some amazing prospect by any means, but I think he's going pretty undervalued due to size.
I love that. And real quick, just in general with running backs, is there a real thing when it comes to speed? Like, obviously you can't be like a super slow running back. Like if you're running like a 4.8 40-yard dash, you're probably not cutting it as a running back. But for someone like Achane that has like a 4.32 40-yard dash, like, do you look at as a dynasty person specifically, and players that have a lot of potential, do players that hit like a certain mark in a 40-yard dash automatically excite you regardless of their production profile? Or is it really production profile first, like speed later? So how important is speed on that list of attributes that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's all about the profile and the production that comes along with it. Because if you just organize like by athleticism or by 40 time, your hit rate just isn't as good. And that's when we're talking about, running back prospects drafted in the second day or first day of the NFL draft. Like if you're just going by speed, you have like Chris Johnson at the top, and then, J.K. Dobbins, Darren McFadden, profile that comes with it.
I love that. And what about someone like Roschon Johnson? I mean, like he backed up Bijan Robinson the last 2 years at Texas. Over that span, he actually led the country in broken tackle rate. He broke tackle on 85 of his 190 touches, which is just an absolutely absurd number. I mean, he's 6'2", 230 pounds, but sometimes people get stuck behind these generational running back prospects like a Bijan Robinson. So does like Johnson get knocked because he was a backup running back in college? And do you think that there is any real potential, or was he aided by the fact that the defense probably wasn't looking as strong when Bijan Robinson was not on the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would also say that he did aid, like when you look at broken tackle rate, he probably did aid from not only better boxes, but he had a lower carry percentage because Bijan Robinson took a very healthy amount of carries. So when you have a lower percentage, it's easier for those rates to be higher because there's not as big of a sample size, shall we say. Like Bijan Robinson could have done that maybe as well on a 20% carry percentage. But yes, he would, like, his highest carry percentage or his highest rushing attempts was when Bijan, before he got there, the year before he got there when he was a freshman. So at 18, Roschon Johnson had a 25% carry percentage, and that was the highest of his college career. Now, I will say this about Roschon Johnson. First of all, I love running backs. Like, if he gets decent capital and he's just falling in rookie drafts like 3rd round, 4th round, I'm just going to take a running back that gets decent draft capital and spot pretty much no matter the profile. But when we talk about Roschon Johnson and some of those stats, like, he was stuck behind Bijan. How does that change his profile? Things like that. I think the issue with doing some things like that is, yes, Bijan is clearly upper echelon running back prospects. When you get into the NFL, there's not too many situations where you don't, like, if you go to a team, there is an elite running back in front of you. Like, even if you say, oh, Roschon Johnson, lands in Las Vegas. Well, yeah, he's not with Bijan anymore, but now he's behind Josh Jacobs because there's so many good good running back prospects or good running backs. When you get into the NFL, yes, he may not be with Bijan, but now he's stuck behind this said already good and invested asset.
Yeah, and I think the situations that we get, like Atlanta last year or Houston, where you have a Damian Tyler Algier and no other running backs that can barely breathe, in those running back rooms. I think those are rare situations, and I would love to see someone like Roschon Johnson end up in those. But like you said, is like wherever he goes, he's going to be behind another talented running back, and that's not going to change whether it's from college to the NFL. These guys are all the best of the best, unless you end up in a backfield with Rex Burkhead. But again, no shade on Rex Burkhead. I loved his years with Patriots, but I digress. What about, we talked about in undervalued quarterback, someone like Devin Achane with a running back. What about wide receiver? I mean, is there someone, like, for me, like, is there someone that is like the most likely wide receiver to produce, big numbers as a rookie outside of Jackson Smith and Jigba, or any other wide receivers that really stick out to you as someone that could produce a lot relative to what people think right now?
Yeah, I think that would be Quentin Johnston, honestly. I think part of why people don't like him is a little bit of the helmet scouting. Like, we've had first rounder Jalen Reagor from TCU. That didn't work out. We've had first rounder Josh Doxson from TCU. That didn't work out. But when you compare production profiles, it's not really close. I know everyone loves to use like Campus to Canton because they have a great trend line that shows the average top 24 running back in terms of the NFL or wide receiver, and then what they produced in that at that season and how we should expect it to grow. So when we look at the trend line, like when you compare it to Jalen Reagor and Josh Doxson, former first rounders out of TCU, they don't have a profile that even comes close in terms of production. When you look at the trend line, Quentin Johnston, yards per team pass attempt, was above the line at 18, above the line at 19, above the line at 20. When you look at like Jalen Reagor, for example, he was only above at 19 and he was well below at 18 and 20. Like, there's way more questions in the production profile for them than there was for Quentin Johnston. Like, the NFL still likes him. They're going to draft him in the first round. He's an alpha level size. We all know that. And he's quite athletic. So when you have a really good production profile, you declare early, and then you have the thing like size and athleticism to boost your ceiling even further. And then when I look at like things like keep, trade, cut, he's outside of the top 30 wide receivers, which just seems crazy because we know all it takes is a rookie wide receiver to just produce or show us things, and that value climbs. Like, look at Jahan Dotson. He wasn't a great prospect by any means. He had a solid rookie year thanks to a high touchdown percentage at 11.5%. And he's wide receiver 26 on keep, trade, cut. Like, it just takes a little bit of something to show, especially when you're a rookie, and the value grows with it. And for someone like Quentin Johnston, the ceiling is enormous. And I think because of former or TCU players, when you helmet scout, it makes people a little bit more worried because people that look like him or have been to a school that he's at haven't fared well, then it's hard to disassociate that for some.
It almost feels like a curse to some people where all of a sudden, just because, one school all of a sudden starts to stick out and break your heart, you can't ever bet on them again because, they just consistently destroy your heart. So I completely feel that. But one player that, comes from a really good school that I'm really excited about is Marvin Mims. I mean, Scott Barrett, a Fantasy Points, one of my favorite people in the industry, did a thread on Marvin Mims the other day, and I really wanted to highlight it on the show today because Marvin Mims is not like, he's not one of the top wide receiver prospects that some people are talking about every day. He's not Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's not Quentin Johnson or Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison or the guys that we constantly hear. And someone's underrated, even though he went to a power school in Oklahoma. But for last year, among all college wide receivers in the Power 5 outside of Jackson Smith-Njigba himself, Marvin Mims was first in career yards per route run. He was first in career yards per target. He had a 90th percentile 40-yard dash and burst score, and he was faster than guys that were smaller and lighter than him, like Jalen Hyatt and Zay Flowers. I mean, guys that were considered the speedsters of the class, and he was still faster than them at a taller and heavier weight, in addition to producing a yards per route run that is as good as anyone except Jackson Smith-Njigba himself. So like, he seems like someone that is going way overlooked right now, when someone that's not even really getting talked about either on fantasy Twitter or even in NFL draft circles, it seems like right now. So am I getting a little bit too excited about someone like Marvin Mims, or do you think we might be on to something that he has some hidden potential?
No, I like Marvin Mims a lot, and I know exactly the thread you're talking about. I really like to see that because Marvin Mims is great analytically when you look at things, and also he declared early. So that's another thing that he is signaling to us that the NFL, he believes, or his agent believes, does like them enough. Like, that's why he forewent his senior season. But when you look at his production profile, production profile alone, he was about as productive when you take in-team context as anyone in this class for the most part, besides like the ultra elite guys. Like, when we talk about Marvin Mims, the last year before he declared, we're talking about someone who put up above a 20% target share, 2.66 yards per team pass attempt, 2.75 yards per team, or yards per route run. Like, the guy did it very solid at a young age. Like, even at 18 years old, like, his per route basis, he ran 4.07 yards per route run. Granted, he didn't run a ton of routes at 18, but he was productive, and given his sample of work from when he stepped foot at Oklahoma, he was good. So if the guy gets draft capital, like third-round draft capital, he is one of the few wide receivers that I will take that cheaper dart throw on because, well, his analytical profile says there's some upside for some success here, especially if the NFL agrees and gives him like third-round draft capital.
Yeah, I've one other stat I wanted to give on Marvin Mims, and again, if once again, just like with JSN earlier, like, if this is probably the one stat I want you to take away from this entire podcast for all of you listeners right now. And these, for the Power 5 wide receivers, these are the best wide receivers by yards per target over expectation. Once again, from Scott Barrett, these are the top 8 receivers. Ready for this? Number 1, Jalen Waddle. Number 2, Jackson Smith-Njigba. Number 3, Devontae Smith. 4, Marvin Mims. 5, CeeDee Lamb. 6, AJ Brown. 7, Jalen Waddle again. And number 8, Ja'Marr Chase. So all I see in there is top 10 wide receiver finishes in fantasy football. The best wide receiver prospect in this entire class in Marvin Mims. I mean, that is a pretty elite, bucket once again to be in. So again, maybe he's a historical outlier, but right now his price is not a first-round pick in Dynasty. So if they're outside of that and you get someone that is on any list with those names of all guys that are elite NFL players, you best believe I will be taking some Marvin Mims in your drafts. We have one last question to get to before we get out of here, and that is like the tight end position. I mean, like, the tight ends that are every year, it seems like they are tough to pick in Dynasty unless you get someone that gets drafted super highly overall, like your, TJ Hawkinsons of the world. But often, like, the tight ends come from the later to middle rounds. We don't know what they are. So for the people that, like myself, struggle with figuring out who the best tight ends are, in terms of a fantasy perspective, like, who is your favorite tight end prospect, like someone that can be the tight end 1? And who is someone else that you think is going later that could have some massive fantasy potential, but could get drafted in like the 3rd, 4th, or 5th round of the actual NFL draft?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this tight end class is one that is perceived as a pretty good one. And it's not one that has an overly great tight end prospect. And tight end prospects, in terms of projecting future success, is a hard thing to do. You want to find guys that have a solid upside and a solid shot to take. But there's really, like, when we talk about elite plus prospects, well, there's a really good hit rate with them. When we go over to tight ends, there's only 3 elite plus tight ends. Like, there's Kyle Pitts, Rob Gronkowski, Vernon Davis. In terms of since 2006, those are your elite plus prospects. So there's not many where you're like, okay, this guy is going to succeed. Like it's going to take more of a rare case or be an outlier for him not to hit. We don't get that as much with tight ends. We get a lot of upside shots. And the good news is usually they're cheaper in rookie drafts. So when you get deeper into drafts, like last year, I had so much round 4 Greg Dulcich because, well, there was a lot in that profile to like, and the upside shots have already paid off. He's worth a lot more than a 4th round rookie pick these days. But when talking about prospects, there's quite a few upside plus prospects in this class, like guys I like taking shots on. The last time that there was 4 upside plus tight end prospects in a class was 6 years ago. And that class gave us Kittle, Ingram, and Njoku, OJ Howard, Gerald Everett. Obviously, not all of them hit in fantastic ways, but the fact you're still getting like Kittle and Njoku, Ingram out of that group, like you're still able to take these upside shots where it's like, okay, there could be some real success. But I will say, like guys like Sam Laporta, for example, he has a really strong profile. And his combine, he measured to be very athletic, which was great to see. And he's going in like the 4th round of rookie drafts where there's really, who cares about what the floor is? Most of these guys are going to bust, and maybe he will too. But the fact that there is that upside shot that late in the draft, that's someone who I like is really undervalued. But even if you want to talk about my favorite, which I know is what you asked, well, Michael Mayer even feels a little bit undervalued versus what normal, like really good tight end prospects. I assumed he'd be a little higher. I kind of agree with where it is, but for where I thought it would be, I thought it would be a bit higher. But he's someone that every year at Notre Dame got better and then declared early. And he may not be an absolute freak athlete, but he's still a solid athlete. He was an 80 percentile athlete on top of a very good, like Notre Dame last year, he put up a 35% receiving yard market share. Like the guy is a very good receiver. At least that's what he showed at Notre Dame.
I love that. Michael Mayer, I think, was the guy for me that when I was doing my research for this podcast that was like really, sticking out like sore thumb. I mean, over the last 10 years, when you talk about just receiving yards per game among like Power 5 tight ends, which I'd consider the best conference, like he had the number 6 best season in yards per game. And other people in that top 10 list included people like Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram. I mean, the guys that were also on that list like weren't guys that were considered like the top tight end in the class. Like there's other guys, like half the list is tight ends that were really, really good in college. And then Michael Mayer, who is the number 1 tight end prospect for this class, I don't think he's getting enough love. I think he should be going higher in rookie dynasty drafts. But again, I will digress. He is amazing, and you should be keeping an eye on him. But before we get out of here, one final question, my favorite question of them all, Ian. You've been a great guest, but what is your 2023 flag plant? It does not have to be dynasty related. It could be anything fantasy football related. Your boldest prediction that you believe in for this upcoming season.
Ooh, I like this one. And because I can just be bold, it doesn't have to be the, most perfect, highest probability. But I'll take, just going off the top of the dome here, I'll take Chris Olave as a wide receiver 1 this year. If you want a little bit of reasoning behind that, well, he produced insane in terms of a per team context individual as he did last year. He was terrific as a rookie, and I think it goes undervalued. He's going like a full round behind someone like a Garrett Wilson, and I don't think that's justified. Like one thing I do is I make a range of outcomes based on players' peripherals and their prospect profile as well. And when we talk about someone like Chris Olave, only 3 other players end up on his range of outcomes based on what he did as a rookie: Mike Evans, AJ Green, and Drake London. And the other thing about Olave is he's a little more QB proof because of his deep average depth of target. So when we talk about Olave, last year he was earning like 26% of targets. Well, he was doing that 16 yards down the field. So inevitably you end up with a very high air yard share. And that itself makes it easier to score fantasy points, even if you don't have, a Joe Burrow at quarterback, because you're getting such valuable targets at such a high rate that I'm going to say my bold take is that Chris Olave in a sophomore season finishes as a wide receiver 1, even with Derek Carr.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, last year as a rookie, he led all NFL wide receivers in yards per route versus man coverage. I mean, he was 8th among all wide receivers in air yards, and Derek Carr, who's new QB, was 2nd in air yards per attempt. I mean, he was above average in success rate versus 9 of the 10 possible wide receiver routes. Again, like this is in his first year in the NFL. Things are only going to jump for him. And I am like all in on Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. I'm sure we'll talk about them on future podcasts. But Ian, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. Real quick, before we get out of here, where can the people find you and all of your amazing work? I think that you are someone that is going to continue to rise higher and higher and higher as long as we do this. And this is going to be one of those shows that a couple years from now, for people will be saying, oh, wow, like you had him on before he was that guy. So like, where can the people find you and your amazing work on Dynasty stuff?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This has been a ton of fun. Finally glad that we got to do this. Love talking prospects and just shot and ball with you. So thank you so much for having me on. For those that want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at dynasty_IM. I post a lot of stats, kind of like similar to how I talked about stats that I've brought up. I even pulled a few tweets for a few stats today, so you can find good stuff there. You can find me at the33rdteam.com, and you can also find me at my Patreon, dynastyim/patreon.com. Got lots of good stuff. Caruso's in there. I know he finds some good stuff in there. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Absolutely. Well, he is Ian Miller. I am Alex Caruso, and this is the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. Don't forget to tune in for episodes coming out every single Tuesday and Friday. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for the next episode, don't forget to keep chasing that upside.